It's a real honor and privilege for me to be invited to speak with all of you for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'm really looking forward to learning with all of you, hearing all your questions and discussing the sort of links between mining and militarism over the course of today's Connect meeting. Apologies if my voice sounds a bit croaky and hoarse. I was part of a very lively Jewish bloc at the march on Saturday in London, and we'll be sort of trying to interlace some of my sort of presentation and research today with obviously more up-to-date events. Um, as Sheila said, I'm a secondary school geography and politics teacher. I've been a member of the London Mining Network for about 6 or 7 years, and we're a very broad alliance of about 30 different member organizations working around human rights, the environment, solidarity with communities around the world who are affected by the activities of mining companies that are based in London or funded by London banks. As I'm sure some of you might be aware already, London is a global epicenter of the mining industry, home to many of the world's largest mining companies like Rio Tinto, Anglo American, BHP, and Glencore. And collectively, these mining companies extract the minerals and natural resources that are at the base of pretty much every single global supply chain, from solar panels and wind turbines to the electric technologies that are bringing us together this evening, and also to the nuclear weapons, the bombs, and the tanks and the guns that are sort of integral to the military industrial complex as well. At the London Mining Network, we take leadership from the frontline communities that we work with who are resisting extractivism daily. Some of the main things that we do involve bringing these social movements and community leaders from the global south to London so that they can speak at the annual general meetings of these mining companies and put their questions directly to mining company executives. We organize pickets and protests and public events outside these meetings so that those community representatives have the opportunity also to speak to the people of London and make the people of London, the UK, aware of what we are wittingly or unwittingly complicit in. And then obviously other things that we do include raising broader awareness about the social and ecological harms of mining and exploring transformative alternatives through research, education, collaboration, and discussion. So the Marshall mining cycle is what this kind of report was all about, and you can kind of see that in front of you. And what we were trying to do in this report was show the interdependent, interlinked nature between the mining industry and the arms trade. And it's important to emphasize from the outset that the main arguments deriving from this research don't belong to me or to the London Mining Network, but they are informed by the people and movements that we work with, whose daily experiences problematize any type of separation between the violence of extraction and the violence of warfare and conflict, whether that's from South Africa to Eritrea, Colombia to Chile, West Papua to the Philippines, India to Mongolia. We work with communities all over the world who know very intimately that we can't separate questions of climate justice from questions around the arms trade and the peace movement as well. What we also then wanted to emphasize in this report, however, is that given that the mining network is focused on the base of all of these global supply chains, is that every fighter aircraft and drone, every bomb being dropped from Gaza to Yemen, every gun and bullet committing acts of atrocities in Sudan and the Congo currently, all of these are deadly assemblages of resources that have been extracted from the earth that leave a trail of destruction in their wake before reaching the ship or the train, the factory, the testing ground, and the battlefield where that devastation multiplies. So before the acts of warfare and conflict zones that we'll be discussing later on this evening, the extraction of these resources has already entailed a huge amount of social and ecological violence. So martial mining and the cycle here is about seeing these processes and places as interdependent and interlinked with each other. And seeing that mining is always already a militarized process, the rupturing of ecosystems, the use of explosives to blow up mountains, and forklift trucks and tanks to fell forests to access natural resources and to remove and displace indigenous communities and other people from their lands, and then to police and secure their access away from it. But equally, on the other side, it's also the argument that militarism and warfare are extractive processes as well. They depend on vast quantities of natural resources in order to innovate and assemble more deadly technologies of control and destruction. I think it is also important to note that mining has been practiced for millennia in various civilizations around the world and isn't inherently a militarized or industrialized process that has all of these negative impacts. But if we look at the history of the world's biggest mining companies that are based in London, it's instructive to the fact that the industrialization of resource extraction has always been inseparable from colonial warfare and racial oppression. So if you look at BHP, the Anglo-Australian mining giant, it was really at the forefront of settler colonization and frontier invasions and massacres in the continent of Australia. It's been one of the primary beneficiaries of that settler colonization as well. Anglo-American, similarly, was at the forefront of the settler colonial movements in Southern Africa. And by the end of apartheid rule in South Africa, Anglo-American controlled more than half of all private industry in South Africa. And then if we look at Rio Tinto as well, for example, Rio Tinto was leading a cartel of mining interests that was essential to developing Britain's nuclear arsenal. Rio Tinto was operating a uranium mine in Namibia called Rusing, which was under occupation by the apartheid South African regime. And that was Britain's main supply of uranium to procure Britain's nuclear weapons. And I think that also brings a really important point and a reminder that nuclear weapons, the kind of most extravagant and atrocious forms of military equipment that we often target our attentions towards. Many of them originate in African mines, uranium mines across the African continent. If you look at the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were responsible for the calculated murder of at least 350,000 people. Those were made possible, that war crime and atrocity was made possible by uranium that had been extracted from the Shinkolobwe mine in Belgian-occupied Congo. So I think by making those kind of connections, we can see just the trail of devastation. And also, we can also hope to find connections between social movements operating in different parts of the world to hopefully strengthen our struggles as well. And I think that history is particularly important in the current context where these mining companies are trying to, similar to a lot of arms companies, rebrand themselves as sort of eco-friendly and environmentally conscious, and mining companies in particular branding themselves as the vanguard of the green industrial revolution, bringing all these cobalt and lithium to electrify vehicles and to build solar panels and wind turbines. But when we historicize these companies, we remember that none of them became multi-billion-dollar corporations innocently, but rather through centuries of colonial, racial, and ecological violence, which is responsible for changing the world's climate in the first place. So it's important that we steadfastly identify them as the arsonists, no matter how much they might want to portray themselves as the firefighters. So the first part of sort of this cycle, if we start off with the sort of community resistance and mining site, I'm going to talk a little bit about militarized mining and some of the sort of profiles and case studies with the images that you can see on the slides here. So mining causes overwhelming degrees of pollution and harm. The United Nations estimates that extractive industries alone are responsible for over half of global greenhouse gas emissions, 80% of ecosystem destruction around the world and 85% of water stress around the world can be attributed to the responsibility of extractive industries, which includes not just mining companies, but agribusiness and agro industries as well. But what we know very well at the London Mining Network is that the destruction of land and water and life has and always will be resisted. And that resistance is inspiring, courageous, brave, but also very violently repressed in many contexts around the world. The Environmental Justice Atlas, which is a great kind of counter cartography online, which maps different cases of environmental injustice around the world, has documented at least 83 cases of conflict surrounding mines around the world linked to those four big London-based mining companies that I mentioned earlier. So if we start off with the Congo, which is sometimes called the sort of silent Holocaust happening in the world, but is generating sort of more attention to the devastation of 7 million people being displaced and 6 million people killed in the sort of wars in the Congo over the past 2 decades, which is sometimes known as Africa's World War, because there are so many different countries involved in that. One of, if not the most important and primary beneficiary of the plunder of the Congo is an Anglo-Swiss mining company called Glencore. And Glencore is the world's largest producer of cobalt. And it has 2 huge mines in the Lualaba region of the Congo. And cobalt is one of the most important minerals for batteries. So laptops, smartphones, but particularly batteries for now electric vehicles as well, but also for military equipment like drones, missiles, and fighter aircraft. So in the Congo, we see a huge amount of militarized resource extraction ongoing. And another really central actor here is a very controversial UN peacekeeping mission, which is trained, or the soldiers within that UN peacekeeping mission, Malawian and Zambian battalions, which are trained by the British Army. The UN peacekeeping mission has a very explicit mandate to establish trading centers for coltan and for gold. It has a mandate to train mining police and also to extend state authority into mining sites. So there are very clear links between the militarism and the mining that are ongoing in the Congo. With the Congo, the resource wealth that exists in the Congo, which should make it the wealthiest country in the world, but is in fact one of the poorest and most deprived countries in the world due to the systematic plunder of its resources over many, many decades. So that's a really important sort of intersection of mining and militarism that we highlight in the report. The second, sort of moving in clockwise direction, is a profile of South Africa. And this is a community which I think I mentioned that I've worked with for the last 7 or 8 years in Marikana, in the platinum belt of South Africa. South Africa is home to about 80% of the world's platinum. And platinum is primarily used to make catalytic converters, which converts noxious, poisonous gases into slightly less noxious and poisonous gases. So you find them in the engines of cars and trains, but also in lots of military equipment like tanks and fighter jets as well. Platinum is one of the most expensive metals in the world, but the mine workers extracting that platinum are paid lower than starvation wages across that platinum belt of South Africa, whilst Anglo American and Lummin, which was another British mining company, are making hundreds of millions of pounds worth of profit for their shareholders every single year. So, of course, that's going to lead to resistance and protest, as well as the contamination of groundwater and the pollution and air pollution that's leading to illnesses for many of the mine workers and communities who live around the mines. So in 2012, there was a huge 5-month-long strike across the Platinum Belt, and Lummin, the British mining company, rather than negotiating with their workers, brought in the South African police and military, who had received over £380 million worth of arms exports from the British government during that year. And they opened fire on the striking mine workers, murdering, massacring 34 of them and maiming another 78. So we've been part of the campaign, international campaign for justice and for reparations for those Marikana mine workers, even though Lunmin has now sold its operations for a nice profit. It's left a legacy of destitution and legacy of unaccounted for violence, which the community is still demanding justice and reparations for to this day. So again, another really clear example of mining and militarism emboldening one another. Finally, we profile 3 Rio Tinto operations in the report. The first is in a small island called Bougainville, which has had a decades-long liberation war to free itself from Papua New Guinea. And at the center of that, there's a brilliant documentary about this called The Coconut Revolution, which you can watch online. But the center of that liberation war was a mine called Panguna, which was one of the largest copper mines in the world and was operated by this British mining company called Rio Tinto, which was releasing over 1 billion tons of toxic waste into the rivers and the soils of a sacred island, which then led to this decade-long civil war in which 20,000 Bougainvilleans lost their lives, which was a huge proportion of their population. Bougainville is currently in the process of ratifying its independence referendum, and Rio Tinto has cut and run from its operations there, but there are still ongoing campaigns for them to repair the damage that they've done to the environment. The second example of Rio Tinto's sort of militarized mining is in sort of similar, not too distant part of Southeast Asia, which is in West Papua, and another military occupation that isn't discussed enough or doesn't gain enough public attention and profile. But the West Papuan Liberation Movement have published really courageous and inspiring and transformative vision of a green state, which an independent state that they would like to see. But they are currently occupied by Indonesia, which has imposed martial law on this region of West Papua, where again, another mine is at the center of this conflict known as Grasberg, which is a copper gold mine, again, one of the largest in the world. Rio Tinto made billions of dollars worth of profit from, then cut and run again from its responsibilities to repair that damage. It's currently operated by an American company called Freeport-McMoRan, but continues to be a site of not just intense pollution and repression, but also of struggles for freedom and liberation for the West Papuan people. So for each of these case studies, the report also goes into British arms sales and military training to the army and the police in these countries. And the essential argument and message, I think, from these case studies, these profiles, is that mining would be impossible without militarism. People don't willingly allow their lands to be stolen and defiled and polluted with toxic waste. People are always going to resist that, and that resistance is met with warfare and repression. So that is what we are sort of terming militarized mining. The next sort of element, let me go back, of this martial mining cycle is what we're sort of calling or looking at as material militaries. The key point here is that once that copper and gold and platinum and cobalt has been extracted, where does it end up? As part of the research for this report, I did contact all of these mining companies, or at least 7 or 8 of them, for comment, and I asked them questions about what the end uses of their minerals were and what their thoughts were on the possibility and likelihood that their minerals were being used to make tanks, missiles, drones, nuclear submarines. Most of them refused to speak to me and ignored my questions, but the silence in itself is revealing. The replies, though, were very interesting and contradictory in the sense that they were very eager to claim responsibility for constructing and being the base of socially useful products like wind turbines, schools, hospitals, and smartphones. But when it came to the possibility that their minerals were being used to make military weapons, it suddenly became too challenging or too complex or too complicated to confirm where those minerals would end up. But of course, how else would these weapons be made? You can see from the images on the slide here, great, brilliant graphics made by a fantastic graphic designer called Kay Stevens, who did all the graphic designs in the report. That all of these military equipment are made out of often dozens of different types of natural resources. So the report goes through Britain's next generation of military hardware, which is 350 billion pounds worth of military equipment, which, as a public sector worker campaigning for a inflation-proof pay rise alongside nurses and doctors and junior lawyers and other sort of friends of mine, the fact that we are always able to find that huge sums of money for warfare and conflict, but not for life and caregiving workers, is always a source of immense frustration and infuriation, if that is a word. So obviously that sort of all this new military equipment, I sort of calculated the weights of all of them, the aircrafts, the fighter jets, the submarines, and it was at least 500,000 tons worth of natural resources going to be required just to make Britain's new generation of military hardware. If you look at a resource like gold, for example, just to extract one ring worth of gold, so a very small amount, about an ounce or two of gold, produces 16 tons of toxic waste, because you need to use things like arsenic, mercury, in order to separate the metal from the ore. So 500,000 tons worth of worth of natural resources like copper, aluminium, titanium, gold, and silver is inevitably going to produce millions, if not billions, of tons of toxic waste in the environment and during that extraction process, which is going to again poison lands, rivers, and communities all over the world. I think a really interesting example of material militaries and how some natural resources achieve a lot of critical and strategic importance within the military industrial complex is the example of rare earth elements, which aren't actually rare in the sense that they are relatively abundant in geologically in the Earth's crust, but they aren't seen as rare earth elements because around 97% of current supplies are located in China. And that is a terrifying prospect to the military establishments in the US and in Britain and in the West in general, because rare earth elements have very important magnetic properties that can't really be replicated by other natural resources. So they're used in drones, battery cells, and other really important military equipment like lasers, X-ray tubes, satellites. So if we look at the fighter jet, for example, the F-35, which is sort of known as the digital jet, that in itself requires 417 kilograms of rare earth elements to make one of those F-35 fighter jets, which importantly are the same F-35s that are manufactured by Lockheed Martin, the long-term supplier and self-proclaimed proud partner of the Israeli army. These are the jets that are currently being used on the assaults on Gaza as we speak. So one of the UK government's responses to this critical status of rare earth elements has been to set up this body called Security of Supply, or SOS, mineral resources. There are lots of different UK universities, mining companies, and also research institutions which have a lot of funding from arms companies that are involved in this initiative. And among other things, what they've been doing is trying to research how rare earth deposits form. And they've been doing this in Madagascar primarily. And Madagascar is not a country that I mentioned earlier, but is another site where there's a very militarized mining operation by Rio Tinto for titanium. SOS Minerals refers to Madagascar in probably the most classic colonial language possible as our own natural laboratory, to try and find out how rare earth elements form there. And lo and behold, we've seen a substantial increase in the number of junior mining companies listing on the London Stock Exchange who are searching and prospecting for rare earth elements. So we've had companies like Rainbow Rare Earths, which is 90% ownership of Africa's only rare earth producing mine in Burundi at the moment. And Rainbow Rare Earths has a contract to supply 10,000 tons of rare earth elements to ThyssenKrupp, which is a German arms company, which supplies frigates and submarines to over 20 navies around the world, including the Israeli Navy. And then another new mining company called Mkango Resources, which is developing rare earth deposits in Malawi, which has been holding, since its inception, discussions with the US Department of Defense, the Pentagon. So there's very, very clear overlaps here between a resource which is deemed as critical and strategic to the military industrial complex, and then an increase of junior, smaller mining companies that are exploring for those. So to kind of repeat, the main purpose of this kind of material military section is to show that sort of it's mining and extractivism that make war and the arms trade possible. So coming towards the sort of finish, the last couple of parts of the report sort of do a bit of mapping and not just of different regions around the world, but also of corporate executives. So obviously weapons aren't bought for aesthetic purposes or a simple demonstrations of force. They're there and used for theaters of war. So we made some sort of counter cartographies of trying to show where particular concentrations of mining are happening and how that then links to military bases that Britain has in areas surrounding those mines. So if we look at Africa, Britain has military bases in Kenya, Sierra Leone, and Ascension Islands, but Britain also has military bases in Belize and Oman, and Brunei, and all of these military bases help to secure and police those mining operations that are happening in neighboring countries. And then also there are those, the sort of green ones are training that Britain is giving to police and armed forces in those countries. So training them in tactics of protest, dispersal, and often these are militaries and police forces that engage in severe acts of repression of communities that are resisting mining operations. So these maps kind of show the connection between British training of troops, selling of arms, and then the securing and extraction of minerals. And then the kind of counter cartography, which sort of trying to show these areas of domination, shine a spotlight on these sort of actors. We see how there are many members of executive boards of mining companies who also sit on the executive boards of arms companies. There's a revolving door between these two industries, including in the highest levels of the Ministry of Defense. There are key individuals responsible for military procurement who have very strong links to many of the mining companies that I've mentioned earlier. And equally, there's important light to be shed on the investors like BlackRock and Legal & General, who have portfolios which are heavily invested in both the mining industry and the arms trade. And these are sort of asset management firms in which many of our pension funds are invested in as well. The aim is to hope sort of that this information can bring together a broad ecology of movements, people who are opposing the arms trade, war, mining, borders, and climate change, and refuse to treat these campaigns and movements as isolated from one another, but imagine new ways of being in relation to each other, and our struggles are sort of shared and indivisible. I will sort of, I did say I was finishing, but I think I did want to raise this point as well, given the context of where I'm speaking this evening. It is a significant and urgent omission and oversight of mine that the report doesn't focus or include a sort of meaningful discussion about the gendered impacts of mining or militarism. So I wanted to sort of briefly mention a few of those. Women and girls are often more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis, from droughts to natural disasters, which increase vulnerability to harm, the challenges of social reproduction. Women are also at the forefront of the social movements that we work with that are standing up for the rights of the land and for a healthy environment. And they face specific threats on top and additional to the threats that men in these movements face, including sexual violence and harassment as a tactic of silencing. And the mining sector is linked to more murders than any other sector in the world. I've got sort of on the slides here some incredibly inspiring non-binary and non-binary people and women who are at the forefront of some of these movements. Nonchalant Batuma, who's been one of the leaders of the Amadiba Crisis Committee, resisting titanium mining on the Eastern Cape of South Africa. Tameka Magwankana, who's been one of the leaders of the women's movement in the Marikana community in South Africa for justice and reparations after the massacre by the Lunmin Mining Company. Bertha Cáceres, who was assassinated by paramilitary private security forces for her heroic leadership of the movement in Honduras against a hydroelectric dam that was impacting on the rivers of indigenous communities on Honduras. And another brilliant documentary called Power Lands, which is directed by this Navajo filmmaker, Ivy Camille Minibitso, which focuses on different extractive zones around the world and the struggle and leadership and resistance of women against those, from the Philippines to Colombia to Mexico. So I kind of wanted to sort of highlight some of those people and maybe emphasize as well that women are crucial in the mining industry. They're both at the heart of capital accumulation and class struggle through their roles in both production and social reproduction around mining sites. There's a brilliant South African academic we've worked with called Dr. Sanda Benya, who calls women the invisible hands of the mining industry, and demonstrates through participatory action research where she's gone into the mines with women and worked with women in the communities around the mine about how through the roles of feeding the community, bearing and raising children, the next generation of mine laborers, acting as caregivers to mine workers when they're sick and ill, washing dirty and ore-ridden work suits, maintaining a sustainable environment, satisfying emotional needs, all of these indispensable activities to the continued accumulation of capital that primarily fall on women, that go beyond simply housework, but are unpaid labor that benefit the owners of capital, but which can equally undermine and resist it as part of class struggle. So when the men were going on strike, male mine workers in South Africa, so were the women, and that were maintaining the strike in the community as well. So yeah, I wanted to sort of highlight that element too. So now generally is the finish, and I'm looking forward to your sort of questions, sort of openings and discussions about what we've been discussing, and thinking about generally how anti-war, anti-militarist and peace movements can both highlight the sort of climate and ecological crisis, the links between those movements by maybe focusing and exposing on the industrial resource extraction at the base of weapons production. But then equally, I think importantly, how the environmental and climate justice movement needs to really be centering the issues of war and militarism in our movements as well, and highlighting how each new aircraft and submarine and every military base and invasion is already a climate catastrophe. And we've seen that with some of the protests happening outside Ithaca Energy this week, which has been given licenses to explore for oil in the North Sea and has a majority ownership by an Israeli company. And Greta Thunberg recently, I don't know if people saw the clip from one of the protests yesterday where they were chanting no climate justice on occupied lands, and making the links between the climate justice movement and Palestinian solidarity, and refusing to see these movements as separate from one another. So I think taken together, these movements can really reinforce the key and core messages of liberation struggles from across the world, from the Congo and Sudan to Palestine and Yemen and to London here, that none of us are free until we all are. So thanks. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and points and discussions.
Brilliant.
Sheila, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was just thanking you, Daniel, for such a comprehensive and wide-ranging, but very, very depressing story that you've been introducing us to. I'm sure that people have got masses of questions. Do you want to put your hands up? I'm trying to see where there are people ready to ask questions. Yes, Paula.
Yes, I've got sort of three disconnected questions. One is peace education. You are in a lovely role doing geography teaching where you can actually bring this into your lessons. But I wondered if you linked at all, either through the union or some other way, into peace education. That's one. The other is, do you link with campaign against the arms trade? Have you done any work with them? And finally, when you do these protests at the AGMs of these horrendous companies in London, would you notify us? Because occasionally, however old we are, we can come along with a placard and help with the protest. There you go. That's my questions.
Thank you, Paula. Really appreciate those questions. Peace education, I want to learn a lot more. I'm in an early journey of my sort of teaching career, sort of third year of teaching, and I know that there's been huge amount of works done around peace education, particularly in areas of the world where there's been sort of truth and reconciliation after sort of civil war and conflict. So I think I've got a huge amount to learn about that, and I know that the NEU has sort of connections with some of those sort of parts of the world, and I hope, yeah, if there's anyone in the room here who has experience of that or can link me up with any places where that's happening, I'd be really, really grateful to know about that. The only other thing that I'd maybe add to that, which is relevant at this moment in time, is that schools are very scared about talking about what's happening at the moment. And our kids are brimming and raging with a sense of injustice and righteous anger about what the televised massacres and war crimes that they're seeing every evening, not just on the television, but on their social media sites. And I think internal discussions that are happening in educational institutions, I think we're trying to push our educational institutions to be educational institutions and to actually take an educational role to what is happening, rather than a role which I think at the moment sometimes is filled with trepidation and a fear of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, because there's also a wider authoritarian climate from the national government about what can and can't be said and done in schools. But I think we are abdicating our responsibility if we're not creating spaces for children to express themselves and how they're feeling. And also, as a geography teacher, as a politics teacher, I don't have to give my own personal opinion about things, but I can teach what I know about the history, the politics, and the geography of these different conflicts around the world. And I think that's perfectly possible to do that and present children with balanced and fair information and historical facts about what is happening, and trusting them to make their own judgments about that, and facilitating and enabling them to if they would like to take appropriate actions afterwards as well. So definitely I'm interested in that, but it's a bit of a minefield as well at the moment, but we're trying to navigate that collectively. Campaign Against the Arms Trade were involved in the sort of discussions we were having about the need for a report like this. And I've spoken at a few Campaign Against the Arms Trade meetings about these links as well. And I've referenced them many times in the report. So I'm a big supporter of what they do. And we will absolutely notify all of you about the AGMs that are happening in the future. We actually have at the end of this month, on Monday, the 27th of November, communities coming over from Peru and Colombia, some indigenous leaders from those two countries who are going to be visiting London and reporting on the impacts on their land, water, and sacred spaces by Glencore in those countries and about their struggle to defend their territory. We're having a sort of public meeting with them. I'll post the Eventbrite in the chat. That's happening on Monday, the 27th. And linked to that, I think there will be some actions outside Glencore meetings as well. But I'm happy to sort of stay in touch about that.
Good, very good. Put up your hands or just talk. I've got Pat, go ahead, Pat.
Yeah. I was just feeling rather overwhelmed by the whole thing and all the interconnections. It's just one long string of things from one to the next, to the next, to the next. And I'm just thinking or asking really, where can we do something, even if it's small, to put a little wedge inside some of this? And for example, who can be held responsible at any point in this for what is going on? Or is there so much obfuscation and covering up that it's very difficult to see anywhere where you can get into it and actually do something, maybe legal responsibilities and that sort of thing? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. I think that's definitely, I empathize with that feeling of it does feel overwhelming, doing the research and writing about it and talking about it even now. And I think some of the purpose of it was to make it feel, to, like you said, to try and find points where a lot of these different industries that are harming the world overlap with one another, so that we can be strategic in targeting where those sort of intersections are. But yeah, I want to acknowledge that emotion and that feeling, but also that the despair can sort of isn't a luxury that we can afford either, and that there are things that we have to do. And like you said, wedges that we can put in the machine, or sand that we can throw in the cogs that kind of stop them from turning. So I guess partly, like I mentioned, those asset management firms that are invested in both mining industry and the arms trade can be sort of areas of focus for, and are areas of focus for, divestment campaigns. the example I mentioned of Ithaca Energy, which is both involved in extraction of fossil fuels in the North Sea and the profits of that supporting or going towards benefiting Israeli apartheid as well. I think where we see those connections and overlaps, I think that's where we can begin to sort of start making interventions that are going to be meaningful in terms of bringing together different movements across different parts of the world. One of the things that we try and do as well is we've set up sort of or been part of a group trying to set up a no to Anglo movement within Latin America. So oftentimes these mining companies they're operating all over the world in dozens of different countries, but the strength and power that comes from connecting those communities with each other so that they can share the information, the knowledge that they've learned with one another. So if there's Anglo trying to set up a new mine in this part of Bolivia, we can put them in contact with communities in Chile and Colombia who've been resisting Anglo-American for a really long time. So that knowledge exchange and transfer is really important so that we're resisting the kind of divide and rule and conquer that these companies rely on in order to continue operating and functioning. Legal responsibilities, I think, is a really interesting question, and there have been legal cases in British courts recently, particularly around the collapse of tailings dams in Brazil. Tailings dams are where all of that toxic waste from mining operations that I mentioned earlier gets sort of held in this big dam. And there were 2 cases of Brazil in the last decade where that dam collapsed and drowned entire villages, where up to 280 people died in Brumadinho. And it was a Brazilian company, Vale, that was responsible for that. But there have been court cases happening here in the UK to hold that company responsible as well. The other thing that I'd mentioned in terms of developments, in terms of law, there are campaigns globally about making ecocide a sort of crime against humanity as well, and whether
Yes.
ecocide could be legally prosecutable, where these companies could be brought to international criminal courts for crimes of ecocide and destruction of the environment. So I think that's an area to also be sort of paying attention to and giving our support to where possible.
That's very interesting because we highlight ecocide. The climate justice exhibition we created originally for COP26, but it's still on our website, has one panel of it on ecocide, and we have a strong ecocide campaigner, and she may well want to pick up on the effects of these terrible effects of mining. So that is a link with something that we are aware of. Questions? Yes, Jenny.
Sorry, my apologies for joining late. I couldn't get in. I'm a pensioner, and my pension is from East Sussex, and there's quite a campaign to try and remove investment from mining investment from that. And I wonder if actually there's cause for be useful to try and get. I mean, many of us are pensioners, and most people now pay, or many people now pay into a pension, and it's maybe highlighting what they invest in is important. Cause pressure, during campaigns to cause pressure on those investment companies.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I really agree with that. I know People and Planet do a lot of work on sort of divestment campaigns and pension funds as well. But yeah, I think that is definitely an area that lots of us sort of pay into throughout our careers and where we can really focus energy towards as well.
Sheila, may I say something, please?
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Bearing in mind that we're also very dependent on these minerals, on the products of mining, are there any mining companies that are less dangerous than others? Are any attempting at all to be ethical in their procedures? And the other thing I'd like to ask is, what about recycling? What about recycling, getting back the mercury, etc., that's involved in processing gold? If we were able to reclaim those, would that help the process, help us to be less dependent?
Thanks, Margaret.
Thanks, Margaret. Those are two really brilliant questions. In relation to the first one on sort of ethical mining or less dangerous companies, there's a reason why, as the London Mining Network, we don't take a anti-mining approach and say that all mining is bad. For example, we have members of the network who are part of mine workers trade unions, who advocate for the jobs, the living conditions, working standards of mine workers. So we don't explicitly or intentionally say that mining is inherently evil or bad. I guess the main thing for that is a campaign called Yes to Life, No to Mining, which its main aim has been about a right to say no. And that links to the sort of Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a UN charter, which says that all people should be able to give free, prior and informed consent to any project that is happening on their lands. So as long as a community has agreed and they've been given all of the information about the possible outcomes and likelihoods, and say, okay, maybe we do want to benefit from potential development that could occur or jobs that could be created, and they have the right to say yes to that. But ultimately, communities should have the right to say no to a mining project as well, and that no should be final and shouldn't be undermined by mining companies, even though they go through various processes and procedures in order to undermine communities and to create that kind of division between them. So the answer to that, which if we're assuming, because probably most of us, if a mining company came to our back gardens and said, we want to start drilling a hole here, which is likely to pollute your water sources and pollute the air that you breathe, most of us would turn around and say no as well. So the likelihood is that there would have to be less mining happening in the world. The answer is exactly what you said, Margaret, which is we need a much more circular economy and recycling of resources and materials. So one of the things, educational workshops that we do at London Mining Network is called the phone cycle game. And it's about the life cycle of a mobile phone. And we do this in schools and universities, and tend to be places where people are quite attached and connected to their digital technology, and get them to think about where those minerals and materials have come from, the impact it's had on those communities, the impact and conditions for workers and factories where those are being assembled. And one of the key things that sort of comes out of those discussions with young people who, again, from my experience of working them, imaginations tend to be less constrained by the parameters of what we might deem to be pragmatic and realistic. And I think that's a real benefit of having that kind of youthful imagination, and that's why young people should be listened to far more seriously and urgently. Is either that there should be living wages for everyone across every element of that supply chain, so that a mine worker in the Congo is paid the same amount as a factory worker in China, who's paid the same amount as a retail store worker at an Apple store in London, and also importantly the same amount as a corporate executive in California who's designing them. And that might mean that the price of an iPhone is £10,000 to £15,000 potentially, if you factor in all of the costs that come from in the ways that companies make profit by the unpaid and underpaying of labor of the workers, and also by not factoring in the costs to the environment. But also what most kids relate to is that when planned obsolescence comes into effect and the new next iPhone 16 and 17 comes out, and 1 year later another iPhone comes out, and what happens to their old iPhones? It goes into a drawer, or even worse, sometimes they just throw it into the bin, and they don't realize that there's gold, aluminium, tin, that there's at least 30 different minerals within each mobile phone that could be recycled again. It's about creating that circular economy that reduces the need for consumption. That's going to reduce the need for mining as well. And if you maybe also draw that into another area which consumes a huge amount of resources, which is transportation, again, does every single human being need their own 1 ton worth of steel and minerals to drive them from one place to another? Or could we invest huge amounts of money in public infrastructure and transport and cycling and walking and pedestrianized areas that again is going to reduce the need for huge quantities of mining if we create a world that is ultimately, I think, going to be much more sustainable, healthy, and enjoyable for people to live in, that isn't dependent on a huge amount of resource consumption. And that's going to create those circular economies, which will empower people across the global south and increasingly in rural parts of the global north as well to say no to mining. And then the companies really do need to listen to that. But thanks, Margaret, for the question.
That's very good. Helen's got a question now.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you very much, Daniel. That was so instructive, and actually, I feel a bit lost for words. It was kind of quite overwhelming, and what you were saying really, not just about militarization, but also colonialism and racism. And of course, you mentioned settler occupation in South Africa, and we're very conscious of what's going on at the moment. And I rather suspect I was in the same block as you on Saturday at the Simon Bolivar Monument. But talking about CAT, the campaign against the arms trade, they did an interesting action a few years ago. And I'm very much, if I'm in London occasionally, would come and join one of your protests outside a manufacturer and wave a placard. But they did something called a walk of shame on a Saturday morning. And it was they took blue plaques around to a lot of the major arms manufacturers, and they looked like the reconstructed ones that you get outside buildings. And it just gave a line or two about what their fantastically unique contribution was to the arms trade. So if you want to do something that, that might be quite a nice model to follow. But thanks for the talk. It was really amazing.
Thanks, Helen. I really, like that idea. Particularly, I like always kind of inversions of and subversion of things. Like those blue plaques are really great. We've done quite a few like walking tours of London as well. I know CAT have done sort of toxic tours around the sort of arms companies in central London. We've done something similar with the mining companies. And part of our educational plan is to sort of make those audio guides, and so a map that people would be able to print off for walking around London, and then listen to a sort of audio guide which would have information about those companies, but also witness and first-hand testimony from communities who are experiencing the impacts of those companies. So I completely agree that we need multimedia forms of education and resistance that people, I mean, that's the thing, when you live in London, you can walk past a building and not notice it. But behind those closed doors, incredibly consequential and deadly decisions are being made. So to visibilize those with a blue plaque, I think is really powerful. But then, also giving that context and information about what's going on there, again, I think is really empowering for people to be able to take action.
Thank you.
Could I ask, something that worries me a lot is that all the apparent alternatives to heavy use of fossil fuel, and we are active in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign. One of the alternatives draw very strongly on a whole load of minerals that you've mentioned, and you mentioned those connections. And when we're arguing against fossil fuels, and it comes up that we're using these things for electrical vehicles, we're using cobalt and so on and so on. What do you say? What do you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, isn't it? Because you can verge in the territory of sometimes, and it's of sounding cynical, and I have to think about that as a teacher as well, who wants to inspire hope in our young people for the future, rather than just overwhelming despair and grief that can become quite paralyzing as well. So I don't always just want to be the person who says, here's a solution, actually this is why the solution is bad, and also almost as bad as the thing that we're trying to solve. So I completely agree. Yeah, we want to have that positive vision as well. And I guess it comes back to, I think, what I said and what Margaret was saying as well about it is the reduction of consumption fundamentally that is going to be necessary, but not framing that as a politics of scarcity, but framing and thinking about the abundance that we have in the world around us to actually really enjoy and benefit from, and that being in community with others, spending time in nature, these are things that actually give us sense of belonging, sense of joy as well, sense of curiosity for the world that we live in. And it's not actually being on our PlayStations until 4 or 5 in the morning on online communities. I don't know, people get joy out of that, but I don't know. I think that's kind of what I sometimes say to the students that I work with. And well, I mean, today I've just been out on a farm in sort of North London with about 30 year sevens, getting very muddy and very wet, petting chickens and trying lettuce and getting them out of the classroom in a way that many of them have never experienced before. And I think that experience again, yeah, shows people that the world is so much more beautiful than any screen that we could possibly be watching or using. And I think that can, yeah, inspire people that this a demand for a reduced consumption isn't about making our lives infinitely worse in quality, but there's actually a huge amount to gain from that. And yes, we do need to dismantle all fossil fuel infrastructure, and that will entail scaling up renewable energy infrastructure. But again, fundamental principles of communities having the right to say no to mining and infrastructure being placed on their lands without their consent, and fundamental premises of investment in public infrastructure, public transport, public services, rather than the privatization of life and everything that atomizes and alienates us from one another. That's when we are able to really, I think, enrich our lives with that abundance of what we have to offer each other as human beings, and what the world has been able to offer us in abundance for millennia over time. So yeah, I guess that's what I'd say to it, but I hope that doesn't sound too wishy-washy.
No, that's brilliant. I'm looking around now to see whether there's anyone left who wants to ask a question, because we've come round to an hour, and I don't want to take more time from Daniel than he is giving us. There's so much in this to think about, and it will be great to re-listen to the recording, because there's so much more than you can think of to note down or pick up on and so on. So thank you so much, Daniel, for your presentation and for opening our eyes to so many things and so many interconnections that Wilf already pursues and thinks about. So I hope we're not going to be too depressed by the negativity of all the stuff. But be encouraged by the fact that women have been leading some of these resistances to these major polluters, and it'll inform us when we go back to our International Environmental Working Group, which has really strong women from a load of countries in Africa, who are always bringing up to our notice how militarized all these extraction industries are within their countries. So thank you so much, Daniel. And but before everyone leaves, I want to say one or two things, which is about the most urgent campaigns that are going on now. The appeal for this weekend is not for a big national demo, but for taking part in events pushing for a ceasefire in Gaza, wherever you are. And CND has produced a listing of some of the places where there are events happening. But I would like to draw everyone's attention, if you're within reach of London, there has been a Women in Black vigil opposite Euston Station every Saturday at 12 for several weeks. And our Women in Black, that comes out on Wednesdays at the Edith Cavell statue in central London, Trafalgar Square. We've been taking along our own leaflets and our own banners, and it's a very good place to be in touch with the public. So I would encourage everyone to take that kind of action on Saturday, to keep pushing, because we're beginning to make a little bit of a headway pushing for a ceasefire. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, Israel is becoming isolated, even amongst its allies. And Jenny wants to say something probably about Brighton. Go on, Jenny.
Thank you. Yes, we are now having Women in Black vigils once a week on a Friday at lunchtime in Brighton, in by the War Memorial, as it happens, which is a very good space with good footfall. Indeed, last Friday, a woman member of the public who was just passing by came and stood and joined us, and we hand out leaflets with the obvious sort of in fact, we used the one that's from London, but alter it a wee bit to give information about ours. I'd also like to say that somebody was asking about what they could do if they couldn't join a vigil or go on any demonstrations or anything. And one of the things that I do is put a poster in the window, just saying, something relevant, sort of like the stop the arms selling, have a ceasefire now, or whatever, just because the more that people see that, the more the message might get through, and the more people might feel emboldened to actually have a poster or placard in their own window. It's just an idea, because it's quite hard to know what to do, and it can be very depressing. A lot of people feel very incapacitated. They don't know what to do to actually address this issue. And obviously, as you say, they are all linked. These things are all circular. And so I just wanted to say about the Women in Brighton as well. So that's it.
Good, very good, very good. Thank you, Jenny. And thank everyone for for coming to this really, really informative webinar. Daniel, you've been really quite a star for us, and introduced us to all sorts of things that we need to start thinking about, among all the other things that we're busy thinking about. So thank you from all of us here, and thank you, friends, for attending this webinar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to stay in
Daniel,
touch.
thank you, everybody.
Good
Thank
luck
care.
with your work.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.